Well, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings to those here in the room. Greetings to the 80 or more gathered online members of the Garden congregation. It is my honor and delight to welcome you to St. Bartholomew's Church in the city of New York, where we are so pleased to have as our special guest Fletcher Banner.
Thank you.
In tribute to the late, very Reverend Robert Willis, former Dean of Canterbury. Robert was meant to be here at St. Bart's today for the third consecutive year as our guest preacher before sadly and suddenly dying earlier this fall. A great loss to us here at St. Bart's and a great many people from around the church. So Fletcher, welcome. We are so honored by your presence
Thank you.
today.
It's great to be here. Thank you. Cheers.
Yes. As my own spouse will tell you, it takes a lot of work to make the magic happen. And so to all the partners and special friends of clergy across the world, we take note. So thank you, Fletcher, for supporting Robert for so many years in such a brilliant and beautiful partnership in ministry. We thought it would be nice to begin our time together just by reading the eulogy written by Fletcher for Robert, a version of which was in the Telegraph as well as in the funeral leaflet at Christ Church, New Haven. Born in lilac season on the 17th of May, 1947, to Vera and Thomas, little brother to 8-year-old Pauline, Robert Andrew Willis was a prodigious learner with a natural fascination and of a shy and slightly awkward disposition which would remain with him through his life. This shyness would be compounded when at a young age he became grievously ill and had to spend 6 months alone in a convalescent hospital, to where his mother would come every day to visit him on the bus, and where he discovered books and writing as two of his great friends. Upon returning home, he then immersed himself in the other great love of his life, music, especially the cello and the piano, and was encouraged by his kindly and loving mother, who adored traditional folk songs and who sang in their church choir, and his more traditional father, who loved hymns and taught Robert a respect for and observance of time and duty. Although a devout Church of England family, Robert and Pauline attended the local Baptist Sunday school as they gave out attractive colored stickers, which suited their already developing aesthetic eye, and the different traditions appealed to their natural inquisitiveness, a quality which in Pauline would later make her such a powerful figure at the Guardian newspaper, and for Robert, such a good judge of character, though with a natural failing of always expecting too much goodness in people, something which others later exploited to cause him great harm. It was the Baptists who Robert always credited with teaching him the scriptures, which he could recite from memory. An eager and conscientious student at Kingswood Grammar, Robert developed an excellent ability at tennis and cricket and horse riding, and excelled in Greek and Latin and at history, politics, music, and English, and his renowned ability as wordsmith started finding form. He approached words from the musicality of the language and enjoyed playing with and forming rhyme, both amusing and of great meaning, a gift which later, when he teamed up with his lifelong friend Richard Shepherd in Salisbury, would bring forth the creation of musicals and skits and, crucially for the church, his hymns. After thoughts of going into the diplomatic corps whilst at Warwick, he then found his calling was to be a diplomat for another kingdom, and went to Cuddleston and studied under Lord Wincy. An astounding communicator and orator who never required a script, he was considered by many to be this century's Wesley. his ability to engage, inspire, trust, and to delegate, but also make the tough decisions, and always to protect and bear responsibility of those under him, made him one of the most outstanding priests and leaders in each of the places he went, from Sherborne Abbey, Hereford Cathedral, and eventually to the highest clergy role in the Anglican Communion at Canterbury, where he was universally loved, trusted, and respected across the political divides, acting as an advisor to the Crown, Parliament, and the Communion. Lord Williams believed that he did more for the Communion than any other dean in history, and his careful and honest managing of the 2008 Lambeth Conference avoided the schisms that loomed after his time. He was awarded the Medal of St. Augustine for his work. In each place he achieved the impossible in terms of unprecedented growth and health for the communities, the buildings, and the church. He strove always to break down barriers and to work towards unity. His ecumenical work earned him a gift of a relic of St. Gregory from His Holiness. However, in his heart, he never stopped being the naughty curate, the one he had been in Shrewsbury, or the mischievous minor canon he had been in Salisbury, or crucially, the pastoral country parson he so loved being in the parishes of that diocese. Even when dean, with no formal cure of souls, he would often go out to minister to folk in trouble at all hours of the day or night, and for him that never ceased being his true vocation. He was always the simple deacon above all else, and would stand as a deacon at the Chrism Mass each year. His joy came from seeing those around him be the best they could be, and he saw his core responsibility, which enveloped hundreds of charities and numerous universities, seminaries, and schools, including oversights of the daily running of the King's School, and before that, Hereford Cathedral School, as being that of facilitator and encourager, which came from his deep and profound faith and his observance of the rule of St. Benedict, where body, mind, and spirit, whatever one's faith, be exercised on a daily basis in a community given to hospitality, and where kindness and love are the only two things that matter. It was all of this and a lifetime of experience that fed into his and Fletcher's global virtual garden congregation ministry, which they started in COVID and still ran on YouTube, over doubling their subscriptions since leaving Canterbury, and their physical ministry of encouragement, which they started after leaving office, and which was seeing them invited all over the world to lecture, preach, or just be with different communities. They wanted each of these to be vehicles of connection in a broken world, for the lonely, a place of love. On this day, a few days ago, which marks the birthday of one of his favorite writers, Robert Louis Stevenson, it seems fitting to quote from his Travels with a Donkey, as we lay this dear departed soul to rest, who has so deeply touched the lives of millions worldwide, and as we return him to the loving embrace of his God, his parents, his sister, and his beloved cat, Monkey. I blessed God that I was free to wonder, free to hope, and free to love. Fletcher writes, "Good night, my darling polar bear. I love you." Amen.
Amen.
Fletcher, thank you for those beautiful, beautiful words, so fitting for our beloved Dean of Canterbury, Robert Willis, and Dean really for the world, as so many thousands and thousands, if not millions, honestly, tuned in throughout COVID. You began your obituary with a little vignette about Robert being born in lilac season. I wonder if you might say a word about the lilacs.
I did, and I will. The lilacs were really important to Robert, and especially around his birthday time. So Robert was born on the 17th of May, and I've actually remembered that because I always forgot every year. And his sister was actually born 7-8 years before him on the 19th. And so growing up, they would always have a sort of bridge of birthdays, and his parents would always bring lilac into the house. And so for him, it always became a birthday when he had lilac in the house. And so that meant for 23 years, that was my responsibility of finding lilac. And very often in this city, it meant walking down in the middle of rainstorms to 28th Street to try and find some. And oftentimes it would be the wrong season because it had broken early or it was breaking late. And so that became a pivotal start to his birthday year. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I think you saw some lilacs in bloom just...
It's incredible, thank you. Yes, I mean, almost miraculously, I was walking with a great friend who's the wife of the Dean of Berkeley Divinity School, where we were staying when Robert passed, Felicity McGowan, and just a couple of days before Robert died. And in one of the gardens, just a couple of houses down from Berkeley, from the wonderful new Berkeley Centre, the lilacs in the garden were all flowering months earlier than they should be. And so we were very excited, and we cut a little bit of it and then took it back, and it cheered him up. So it's nice to think that he had that smell with him and on his last days. And then we were able to go back and borrow a little from the garden again for his coffin, for his casket at the funeral. So no, that was a really lovely divine gift, I think, for that very difficult time.
Wonderful, beautiful, if unseasonal. And it strikes me the many ways in which really creation and the environment so played into your ministry together throughout the years at Canterbury, and then when the Church of England shut the churches down in COVID. Robert is storied to have said, well, if we can't worship in the cathedral, we will bring the cathedral to the world by worshiping in the garden, with all the furry creatures and critters and ducks walking by and birds chirping and singing and the occasional blooper with a cat, crawling under his robe or whatnot. But I'd love to just hear a little bit about both how creation played a role in Robert's spiritual sensibilities, but also just walk us through kind of your ministry together in Canterbury and the different phases from the early days and the Lambeth conferences, then as COVID came along into the garden, and then really bringing the cathedral physically to the world as you traveled around the church.
Sure, if I could do that in two sections. So if I take the natural environment and creation first, I think that was something which was always really important to Robert. And he, as you said, was always the country parson, and so at the heart. And so even when he was working in cities and sort of quite distant at times, especially when traveling from the countryside, he derived enormous pleasure and strength from connecting with the natural environment, so with trees, with walking in a park, with the colour of the sky, whatever it might be. And I think he was always acutely aware and intuitively aware of the change of seasons, of bird song, of sort of the tiniest little details. And that, I think, had always meant that he'd had pets at home, so there'd always been a rather fearsome story of a cat that he had once called Boris. By all accounts was much less tame and friendly than our cats, but there were dogs and stories of other animals in his past. But I'm afraid that most of the menagerie in the zoo, veritable zoo, that happened in Canterbury was my fault. As many of you will know, I'm sure, that the minute you start sort of getting animals, then it's very easy to then start getting more, and it sort of snowballs, and especially when you've got a wonderful garden with the size of that. Although I don't think any of us really realised that we'd go from having a couple of cats to having pigs and having chickens and guinea fowl and God knows what else we had. And every morning he would get enormous pleasure from going out and sort of spending time with those and relating to them, and seeing them as an absolute integral part of God's creation, and the sort of spirituality around that, and the diversity of creation. But I think that in terms of our ministry together, that came about really by chance. And so we met originally when I was working at the school in Canterbury as a graduate job, and was heading up the administration, sort of oversight of the administration of the school. And so Robert at that time was the chairman of governors, and we met because we were working alongside each other at many of the events and functions, and became good friends. And really it started with a really wonderful friendship, and then and his terrific ability at sort of helping me through some very difficult personal problems at the time. And really our relationship grew out of that. And I then went on to London and was working in London, but always home was in Canterbury by that stage, and was working in Parliament, and then had been headhunted to sort of run up a property investment company. And the difficulty was it came to, and I think most clergy spouses will relate to this, that the time constraints on clergy matched with the time constraints of people that are busy in a secular life are impossible to manage sometimes. And so,
that was on the calendar?
Yeah. And so I think that we became ships that passed in the night, and we found it extremely difficult to sustain the relationship and to still sort of see one another. And so I think one of us needed to make a sacrifice. It wasn't going to be Robert. And so it meant that when the company that I was working with was going through some changes, it allowed me to sort of step back slightly, spend more time at home. And when you're a clergy spouse and you're at home and people think you have time on your hands, you then suddenly become very busy because people ask you to get involved in different things. And we'd started the capital campaign at that stage, which meant much more travelling over to this wonderfully generous country who paid a substantial amount of the money for the major restoration on Canterbury, for which we were always eternally grateful. But also the expansion of many of the projects and the things that Canterbury was doing, and our school as well. So that meant that almost by accident, I fell into a full-time volunteer position with him, and our ministry really started developing from that point. That was incredibly difficult at times, and so when we go back to before that stage, and we had the 2008 Lambeth Conference, for instance, you mentioned the conferences, with wonderful Rowan Williams, who was just terrific, and managed to really keep everybody together with an amazing ability of trust, authenticity, and sort of honesty. I think that the people forget so quickly, but the schism that was looming at that stage, with very polarized views on the Liberal side, rallying around people like Jean Robinson, on the other side Archbishop Akinola, and it was a very difficult and spiteful time. But I think that having two people of great integrity, like Robert and Rowan, in the middle of that, meant that it managed to hold firm. And I think that people just trusted them, although they may think differently. They understood that they could trust those people. But in the midst of this, Robert was living with a same-sex partner when it was still illegal in the Church of England to do so, and so that was incredibly difficult. Again, Archbishop Rowan made that much easier as far as he could go by legalizing cohabitation. So it didn't go quite far enough, but it was as far as he could push the agenda at that time. And we were immensely grateful to him for the work that he did in that, because it really did change our life. Before that, we had photographers from major newspapers in our front garden, and so it meant at times I'd have to be smuggled out of the house, and I mean it was a difficult period, but I think that what doesn't break you makes you stronger, and so I think that we ended up being so symbiotic in our relationship, because the closer we were, the less chance there was of other parties getting in between us and sort of causing trouble, and of course that's something very difficult to sort of come to terms with now that he's not there, because it did mean wonderfully that for many years that the two of us became one person almost. We worked together, we socialized together, we had a wonderful life together. But it did mean that we would finish each other's sentences, and we sometimes never even needed words because we had such a close relationship that we would just be able to sort of sense what each other was thinking. And of course that came into compositions and the work that he was doing for writings, and you touched on his hymns already. But also, and it's actually wonderful timing today, but he was helping to write a book on ethical wealth and ethical giving, and of course on this very intentional Sunday here, with the crucial message of supporting the community and the work of this church, that was just as Bishop Wolf mentioned this morning. really sort of addressing the fact that Christ never had an issue with wealth. He had a massive issue with the hoarding of wealth, and the fact that if you are given wonderful advantages in life, then those advantages must be shared with other people for the benefit of humanity. And so I now have to try and find, and I'm conscious that they'll probably be watching this, and I am going to do it, but I need to find his scribblings so that those can now be sent through for the completion of the book.
Wonderful. I did not know until really reading his obituary about his time being ill as a child, and to see someone who had so many amazing gifts and talents and blessings to share with the world. It was so really moving for me to learn that he had had some significant challenges and struggles along the way. And when I read that his mother would daily visit him there in the hospital, it all made sense, because I thought, wow, that's what Robert did for each of us. When we were in the isolation of COVID, he would daily visit the millions on screen with that word
really
of
lovely,
hope and touch and connection. Tell us how that all came about. Because you're really reaching thousands.
We did. I mean, to actually to the point, I think that he was a composite of his two parents, and to his dying day would think always of his parents, and who he absolutely adored and loved. And as you've mentioned, that his mother was extremely loving. I never met them. They both died before we were together. But Robert would tell so many stories. And his mother was extremely loving and kindly, and his father was quite Victorian and authoritarian, but loving in his own way. And I think that Robert was a mixture of both of those things. He was innately kind and extremely generous, but actually absolutely observed the offices of the day, the psalm of the day, and of course there was a mention at his funeral about the humour from a great friend, Geoffrey Tristram, who relayed the fact that he'd had a conversation with him, and Robert said, "Oh, it's this particular day of the month, that means it's Psalm such and such." And Geoffrey said, "How on earth would you know that?" But the incredible thing with Robert, that he could actually from memory have recited that psalm too. So he had this extraordinary mind, this extraordinary ability. But I think that it was the composite of those two things, the sort of regularity and duty and sense of responsibility, coupled with a loving heart, that actually fed into his lifetime of ministry, and then actually communicated through his virtual ministry. And one of the things that we were extremely nervous about, because how it came about originally, I mean, many of you will know, and the Garden Congregation know this, and Robert's spoken about this on many occasions, but initially, quite wisely and quite understandably, the congregations were asked not to go into their places of worship. Unlike elsewhere, and unlike the other denominations in the country, the decision was then made that the clergy would not, although caretakers could go in, the clergy also would not be allowed to go in. And so the broadcasting from within the building couldn't happen. And so when he came back, we actually still went in daily and said a daily mass, because we felt that it wasn't going to stop on our watch, and that, by reputation, whether this is true, I don't know, I somehow doubt it, but the tradition is that there's always been a daily office said in Canterbury from the time of Augustine. And so we felt that it's gone through world wars and pillaging by Vikings and plague and Black Death, and we thought, well, it's not going to die while we're there. So we said the daily office, but out of respect for our brothers and sisters who couldn't go into their churches, it felt a little bit vainglorious to sort of be broadcasting still from in there. So we didn't want to do that, and so we decided. I said, if you want to go out into the garden, I'll bring a camera. Never having picked one up before, I think if I'd known a little bit more about it, I probably wouldn't have been quite so brave. And said, and I'll film you. And so there might be one or two people in our congregation who might like to sort of, have a little bit of prayer time and to still connect. And of course it started from there, and then became, wildly popular. And I can remember in the first week, there was a lady from Australia who wrote in. And I said, "Hey, Robert, there's this lady from Australia. How does she know about us?" And of course, stupidly, of course, it's the internet, so anybody in theory can know. And I was thinking, it will be somebody around the sort of, a mile within Canterbury. And suddenly, this lady from Australia, who's still in touch now, but then, of course, people started speaking. And the surprising thing for us was the fact that the message from Robert which we would work on quite heavily beforehand and do research and things, especially when it became more complicated. We would talk about historical facts and different sort of people that we could find inspiring to help us get into the scriptures and to unpack some of the sort of complicated writings of the Bible. I think that the surprising thing was that that was a message which communicated across denominations and across faiths and to people of no faith, and to many people who had, for one reason or another, and probably everybody in this room could write the list, had been damaged by church, and corporate church. I'm not talking about individual denominations, because actually there's culpability and wonderful blessings with each one of those. But they had detached themselves and then felt very reticent about going back in. And actually what we hadn't appreciated was the fact that actually in the intimacy and safety of their own homes, they could then connect with the spiritual self, not of ours, but within themselves. And so we were just a sort of conduit, really, for them to reawaken that spark within themselves. And then to sort of, after COVID, and increasingly before the end of the pandemic, they then felt that need growing to re-communicate with other people around the table, or whatever their tradition was, or in their places of worship. And I think that to know that we had a little part in that was really that was the most special part about the whole thing. To sort of think that we'd given that ability for people to trust again and to be able to come back into a community where they'd felt so lonely.
Dean Randy Hollerith of the Washington National Cathedral gave a brilliant sermon at the funeral mass. Randy considers Robert to be a great mentor of his, and he said, you all, the National Cathedral was equipped with thousands and thousands of dollars worth of technological equipment as soon as COVID began, and you and Robert were able to manage with an iPhone and a stick.
I have to say it was a borrowed camcorder, so it wasn't actually a phone, but yeah, I think that it was sort of innocence at large, honestly, because I think that there was an enormous amount of editing and things that then took place later, and that was a wonderful thing. And Robert spoke very often about the fact that creative gifts lie inside each one of us, and for us, from the Benedictine tradition, that comes from one's spiritual side, and that's where all of the wonderful creativity and ingenuity comes from. And for me, that was editing films, and so each day that would maybe take 7-8 hours of editing sometimes. So. But it was a great thing to discover within myself. So yeah.
And a resourcefulness too. Robert was known to have a fondness for St. Gregory's advice to Augustine to use what you find, use what you have. And so that spirit of resourcefulness and hospitality was always so evident in your and Robert's ministry together. Dean Hollerith also talked about how so many people came to find healing and a love for the church again, or in some cases for the first time, because the garden belongs to all of us, just as creation belongs to all of us. But it's that same spirit of hospitality and generosity that characterized the whole of Robert's ministry. Every time pilgrims from across the Anglican Communion and beyond came to Canterbury, he would say simply, "Welcome home. This is your cathedral. This is our cathedral together." And I remember personally being invited with the Berkeley Divinity School at Yale pilgrims to Canterbury. And as he did with so many groups, he would take pilgrims into the high altar area at midnight.
Yep.
Pitch black.
Around the site of the tomb.
St. Augustine's tomb.
Thomas Becket's. Yeah.
And share just the most, dare I say, mystical time of prayer and reflection, where you could just feel the saints gathering around you. It's been said that a dean has an almost unreasonable love for his cathedral, and that came out so evidently in Robert's life and ministry. Would you reflect just a bit on his
I would. I mean,
gift for
actually, well,
hospitality.
if I might step back, and pardon me, but I might step back just once to, again, talk about the virtual ministry just slightly, and then I'll come back onto that. That actually, for us, there was a natural progression from what we'd done for where are we, sort of 19 years, I suppose, in the real world, with opening the house up and having, I think towards the end, sort of 25, 30,000 people through the house and gardens every year. We believed that that house only came alive when you had people in it. And it was, it was a very deliberate house in the fact that it was very large, it was very palatial, but actually it was one of the most important embassies of the whole Anglican Communion. And so the work that was done there, not only for the cathedral itself and the community and the wider community, but for the city, the county, the Church of England, and then the Communion, and also into faith work, was enormous. And the fact that you had a house of status put a post holder, who of course was sort of appointed to be a check and balance for the Archbishop, and that tradition goes all the way back to pre-Reformation times, back to the Pope, and so of course it's now a crown position, but before that was a papal position, and even when Robert went there, it was extremely contentious as to whether the authority and the choice comes from, but I think that gave that person the credibility to be able to host papal representatives, to host the Pope in 1982. It mattered that actually, and in a real world way. And I think that there's a misunderstanding that that must be inherently bad. But of course, what that meant was that you could then get politicians, you could get heads of state to sit up and take notice. And so the work for God, the work for the community, for those that aren't recognized, actually then is much easier because they realize they're dealing with somebody of an equal level. And I think that that in that way, we have become very used to using that house, a wonderful home, for that greater good. And we were very used to sharing our lives completely with anyone that came, because we would have 6, 7, 8 functions a week, and and countless people through. And there's no living a private life, and there's just the two of you, and you've got all of those people around you. So there was for us, it just seemed natural. Why would we not talk about everything, about our lives and about everything else? It was the biggest self-indulgence going, honestly. And so just going out to the garden with a couple of mugs of tea and our pets, and just talking about rubbish, and people tuned in. But I can remember friends who are well known and celebrities in England sort of saying, "You're very brave talking about all these things. We would never talk about all these things, with the public." But for us, it just seemed perfectly ordinary. And the incredible thing is that it was brave looking back, because being in a same-sex relationship at a time when that's extremely volatile, and times that we have known personally that have been extremely painful, that it could have gone horribly wrong. And in one or two ways it did go horribly wrong. But actually, as far as the people were concerned, they didn't care. And so actually, I think that there were a lot of people that sort of looked to us, and maybe even if they'd come to that situation and the realization that Robert was in a same-sex relationship, that if they'd had problems, the more they spent time with us virtually each day, the smaller the problems they had became. And so it sort of works them through. And we have many letters of people sort of saying, we weren't sure that we understood this or could get on board with it. And then we thought, well, it's exactly the same as every other relationship we know. And so we then realized that we didn't have an issue with it any longer, and that we didn't believe that Christ would either. And so actually there was a sort of dovetailing of the real world ministry into the virtual, which was sort of seamless for us. And you're going to have to remind me about the second part. Sorry, the spaghetti brain.
Me too, but let's just go with the train of thought. Thank you for that reflection. Because I feel like you did sort of gloss over. Oh yes, we were a same-sex couple living at Canterbury during the Lambeth Conference. That's actually a really big deal.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if you could speak more just to your evolving understanding of the real influence and impact your and Robert's relationship has made and is really continuing to make with ripple waves in the Church of England, as well as the broader Anglican Communion and the broader church Catholic, whether here in the Episcopal Church or in other places around the globe?
I think that one of the great advantages of being in Canterbury is the fact that you are, and this was touched on by some of the speakers at the funeral on Wednesday, that you are in almost a completely unique position because it's not a political role. And Robert never wanted a political role. He was offered bishoprics. There were people, I don't think it could have happened in reality, but there were many people that wanted to push him into the archbishopric in the past. And in many ways, his gifts would have been phenomenal. But I think it would have destroyed him. And I think that actually he wouldn't have been able to have the relationship that he had with me, and I think it would have been a very lonely role for him. But I think that to the point that we just got on with being ourselves, and I think that we knew, each of us had worked through our own personal demons. Nobody chooses to be gay, and so because it's a very difficult life, and especially if you're in the church. But I think that we just decided to be ourselves as much as we could when time and circumstances allowed, and he always left it to me to choose. So if we had visiting groups coming, because of the geopolitical norms of parts of the world, which we felt primarily the only thing that mattered was the sanctity of Canterbury and the fact that any comer to Canterbury felt at home there. And so nothing that we said or did should ever put them in any kind of way to feel uncomfortable or to feel that there was a sort of distance. And so we were a conduit, and we were there to serve there, and as with the wider community, not just the two of us, but many other people. I mean, in terms of sort of staffing and the school included, and volunteers, there's about a sort of 1,500 number, for sort of staff and volunteers across the whole community. Robert's main primary purpose was to make sure that every person that came, whether they were of the Episcopal or Anglican tradition or Christian or non-Christian, could communicate with the power that is Canterbury. Our grandstanding and political messaging would have been very hurtful for many people and really disorientating. And so it was a case-by-case basis. And if we were hosting people in the house, that meant that sometimes we would have people from certain parts of the world where that would have been inappropriate. So I would not have been present. Other parts of the world, I would have been. And we would just judge it as to where, and that was never complicated for us. It just seemed a natural thing to do. But I think that over time, the society in England has changed enormously over the last 20 years. Society in this country has changed enormously over the last 23 years. And so I think that what we've seen is that the church, in many counts, actually is almost sort of behind the curve, and that the society across the board no longer has an issue and is actually quite bored, I know I certainly am, with all of these internal wranglings about sexuality, when actually people just want to get on with the business in hand of serving the poor and getting out onto the streets and doing the work that the church should be doing, and not lots of navel gazing. And sorry, I'm getting onto a hobby horse here. But I think that by being a quiet example in the middle of that storm, and always, we used to borrow the Queen's adage of sort of never explain and never complain, and I think
that's so much better than don't ask, don't tell.
It's so much better, and so and it's a lot more positive, I think, and so which was her to a T. But I think that that you don't win hearts and minds by smashing them over the head and sort of forcing them into a corner. And so being in that very unique position in the middle, we would know, and we'd seen that in this country as well. And we did enormous amounts of work with the Episcopal Church at the time of the schism and sort of following. That sometimes people just need space and time. That if they're encountering something which is very alien to them, and that might be on sexuality grounds, it might be on gender issues, it might be on many other different things, that they just need to be able to come on board with it and to be able to understand what the issues are and to be more familiar with it. And most right-thinking people do find themselves sort of going towards a more liberal side, if they're allowed to, and if they're not wrestled into a sort of a cabal and sort of told that that something's inherently evil when it's clearly not. And so I think that that meant that we could be at times much more. Forgiving is not the right word, but perhaps a little bit more open-minded to people that were of an extremely conservative and sometimes quite hateful and offensive sort of stance towards us. But then the irony is that I always laugh. It was not in your year, I add, but somebody from your seminary who was sitting at our dinner table, and I'd said that we need to be patient because people just need time and they need courtesy. You don't. And we're seeing this in a political field in both our countries right now, that you don't solve the solution by sort of smashing the other person over the head. And so you've got to find a peaceful way of finding a chord in the middle. And sometimes that's incredibly difficult. And I'd said this, and she turned around and said, well, you're just homophobic. And I thought, you're sitting here at my dinner table with my partner at the other end of the table, and I thought that's a very strange stance.
Those Yaleys.
Those Yaleys. And so I think that sometimes the most illiberal people are liberals, and I think we need to remember that at this time. And so I think that it's really important that we find a way of sort of moving forward together always, and to try and bridge any gaps that we have. And so that's what we'd always try to be in the middle of all of that.
Well, on behalf of the church, thank you for your witness. It is powerful. Speaking, even as someone who has long been on board with LGBTQ+ inclusion, and I'm sure many in the room resonates, it is powerful to see a same-sex couple not just doing ministry, but doing ministry together at the literal heart of the Anglican Communion, where it all began. Not on the periphery, but at the center of the tradition. Your and Robert's ministry has transformed more hearts and minds and lives than you can possibly know through your quiet hospitality and, dare I say, prophetic hospitality. Just you being you and Robert being Robert together has been a transformative gift to the whole church.
Thank you.
That will continue making an impact for many years to come.
Thank you. There are many people doing amazing work, and so I mean we just served the dinner, and so and so we did very little compared to many other people out there. But thank you.
For sure. Well, we want to take any questions that you may have in the room. You can get your questions to Peter. If you're online, you can drop your questions in the YouTube comments or email Peter Thompson at pthompson@stbarts.org. And do we have any yet?
We do. We have a few questions. I'm going to sneak in one of my own, though, before I get to the submitted questions. As you know, Fletcher, Robert and I connected a lot on his fascination with hymns, his scholarly interest in hymns, and as a hymn writer. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little more about Robert Willis, the hymn writer.
Indeed. I think that it was something which, Zach's mentioned it, that I think that he had an amazing intuitive ability with words. He loved words and he loved music, and for him they were completely synonymous and interwove. And that he kept a daily journal from the age of 16. So when I go back, I've got to try and make something of those. There'd always been an intention that he was going to publish those, and those eventually will go to Yale, so they're going to Berkeley Divinity School. And I think that the process of writing actually for him was always really important, the actual physicality of writing. And so he was completely IT illiterate, which made my life quite busy at times, especially if he was working, as he had been in recent years, on different commissions. Because I was the one that sort of transposed, which actually wonderfully allowed us to sort of work in connection with one another. So he would sort of, even with the hymns, but especially with his writing and ghostwriting of different books, that he would dictate something and say, oh no, you don't want that, you don't want that, and say what you want is this, and so it opened wonderful conversations for both of us in different ways. Really, he had started from a young age sort of writing ditties and writing sort of comic verse mostly. He was hugely inspired by a whole range of different musicians and different composers, and particularly ones which were amusing and witty. And so I think that it was one of the bishops of Salisbury who sort of said to him at one stage that I think that actually you should put this to some good use, and you should actually start writing some sensible things, and I want you to write a hymn. So he commissioned his first hymn, and then since then the hymn writing then started. And I'm scrambling for the name of the bishop, and it's one of those moments where I'm going to have to get used to because Robert's no longer here to sort of consult with. But he He just really enjoyed it. And the sadness of him passing too soon was the fact that the next 10 years really was the time when he was going to be writing many books and writing many, many more hymns. I think that within his journals there are possibly many verses and sort of different, even sort of different hymns possibly that might be extracted. And so there may still be some other pieces that could come out, which would be terrific. But yeah, no, he just really loved hymn writing. So.
Great. And as we mentioned, if you're joining us online, you can submit your questions into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. If you're here in the room, there are question cards on your tables, so just raise your hand. Stephanie or I will come around and collect them. We have a few questions about the Garden congregation that were submitted online, and I think the Garden congregation is in full force today. We have 200 watching now, people from several different countries all over the US, the UK, Spain, France, Canada. One person wonders how the Garden congregation grew. How did you get the word out there early on in the pandemic?
Completely organically.
Pun intended.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you. Yes, intended. Absolutely intended. There had been, I need to be careful with this, but there had been a resistance to promoting it from the normal avenues. Despite that, it meant that really word of mouth. And I think that there was a really wonderful notion in the fact that that this really inclusive and progressive sort of voice was coming out from the heart of Canterbury, the fact that people almost told one another about this thing that they could tune into, and so many people discovered it afresh just by Google search or by YouTube search or whichever platforms they were looking on, because it was going on different platforms originally, actually sort of gave us a real buzz, because there hadn't been this sort of, fortune spent on advertising or sort of, or getting people to sort of mention it at opportune moments. That instead it really was people that were finding it for themselves and actually interpreting it in their own way instead of being told what this is as a product and being able to sort of receive it in that way. And so, yeah, it was and pun intended, it was a complete organic growth.
We have another question about how you and Robert decided to expand your ministry after he retired as dean.
Robert had never had any intention of retiring, and it was quite a shock, and without much warning of the fact that we were leaving Canterbury. Robert was, when he started his ministry, there was no retirement age, and then came in after he'd started being a priest. He was very much of the old school, where you do that much like the Queen, that you do that till the day you die. So I think in terms of the ministry, it was natural that there would always be a form of ministry, and that he had committed his life to the church and to God, and that meant that until his dying day, which he managed to do, he was still sort of working for that larger cause. Initially, there was a sort of period of great pain and confusion following Canterbury, and we somehow sort of picked ourselves up and sort of mended ourselves and sort of moved forward. Honestly, it was this country, I think, when the invitation came through, and in the same way that when we were first together, for years before ever we could be public about being together in England, because of risk of being, and very real threats, of Robert being sacked and never working again and having his pension taken away, that here it meant in one of these bizarre transatlantic situations that the English or the Americans have always benefited from, what happened in America stayed in America, and what happened in England stayed in England. And so it meant that we could be here doing ministry together and making wonderful friends and making a life for ourselves years before we could in England. For us, I think that within the context of our relationship together, this has always been our sort of spiritual home. And the same happened that I think it was you guys, actually. I wonder if this is a planted question. Now I come to think of it. And so St Bart's, New York, Park Avenue. They'd been in touch to ask if Robert would come over and preach. And I think that was the first trip back over again. And I think you had a dialogue, and Robert just really enjoyed it. And it started to mend his very broken soul and heart, and to allow him to sort of start trusting in the church again. But once again, it had been the Episcopal Church, and I would say underline as well the Church of Canada, that really sort of helped us through that really difficult time. And that then grew grew and grew into what we sort of nicknamed a sort of ministry of encouragement, where we were doing broadcasts still, typically longer films, highlighting the work of different charities and different organizations, not just in this country, but in Monaco, in France, in Spain, and elsewhere. Many of you will have just come back from the pilgrimage on the Camino. And of course, we've opened the Episcopal Anglican Center in Santiago de Compostela, and worked with the Spanish Reformed Episcopal Church over there. And that, again, has meant working with the state of the city of Salamanca and sort of elsewhere, and being conduits really for using our platform to really shine a light on people that otherwise wouldn't get much highlight. So that was really energizing. And next year, I mean, each year, I don't know how we would have found enough hours in the day, but we had a 7-week tour through the Midwest this year, which was actually was Bishop Wolf's suggestion, because he said, look, I know that you always come over and you go on the seaboards, but I think that you'd enjoy going up through the Midwest, and I think that people would benefit from your visit. Unbeknown to us, that would mean amazing accolades of being given the freedom of the city of Oklahoma, the wonderful David Holt, the mayor there, and really sort of working effectively with so many indigenous tribes and with representatives of Greenwood Rising in Tulsa and a whole broad spectrum of different schools and institutions. And then next year, the work had been ramped up, so we had 3 different tours across the states planned and into Canada to go up and meet the Inuit in the Yukon. And really just, again, speak about our view of the inclusive nature of Canterbury and the ideal, really, of proper Christianity.
Well, that's all a good segue into the next few questions, and I promise none of these were planted. Someone did wonder about your connections to the U.S. and the home it seemed that you all found here, especially in post-retirement ministry. And there was another question specifically about your connection with Yale and with Berkeley.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've covered a lot of the first question already. Really, it just came, and increasingly through invitations. So home is, I'm a Kent boy, I'm a Canterbury boy. So I was first in the cathedral when I was just a few days old. And so, and I went to a Canterbury school, Canterbury, the Anglican University. And so for me, the cathedral was hardwired all the way through. And I'm very much a sort of, a boy from Kent. So we did move away initially. And then we thought, well, actually all of our friends either had no attachment to the cathedral or we wanted to give clear space for the person that came after us. And then we realized that most of our friends didn't go to the cathedral. So actually there was not much point in being away for the sake of it and constantly coming back to Kent to visit them. And so it meant it was easier to then come back. And so home is very much Kent, and we didn't have any plans for where to live. And so we moved in with great friends of ours, some of whom were over this week for the funeral. And it's just been great. We've got this sort of little community and sort of commune, which we'd really enjoyed. And the cats have a wonderful house to sort of live in, where one of our housemates is actually their vet, so they've known him and like him better than they do us. So actually the cats are very happy. But I think we only spent something like 6.5 weeks in the UK last year, so not much more than that. And so because of the traveling overseas, and so through Europe to China, to the States, to Canada and elsewhere. And so that was the notional home, and it always will be for me, for Kent. And then I think that America has become our sort of spiritual home, and where our hearts really lay. So.
And anything to say about Yale and Berkeley?
I think I'm trying to think how far it goes back. I think there was an annual pilgrimage for the senior year, where the senior students were brought over each year to spend a week, and actually I think it might be even slightly longer than that now, in Canterbury in the Mother Church, and they would go around and sort of spend time. I mean, both of you have done this, and spend time going around to different sites. So to Coventry with the Cross of Nails ministry, and to often to meet with Archbishop Rowan Williams, and to sort of have time with inspirational figures in the English Church, and that tradition was so well entrenched that by the time that the current dean came, and I think that at that point maybe it was only 4 or 5 days, I forget, but the current dean, the wonderful Professor Andrew McGowan, he came with felicity to, and this might have been one of your years. I'm trying to remember quite when that was, to assess whether or not this would continue. And the community of Canterbury just loved Berkeley coming because it was always such fun and it was just terrific. And when we benefited from the learning and the shared time together. And then I remember a lunch sitting in our morning room at home and Professor McGowan saying, "Oh well, I've looked at this and I don't know that actually I feel that it's worth carrying on in the current sort of state." And Robert's and my heart sank because, well, this is really sad. I mean, there's a new dean and naturally he wants us to change things. And he said, because I just feel that, that we don't spend long enough in Canterbury, and we need to spend longer here. And so, and of course, we, we were jubilant. We were so happy. And he said, but also I want to bring the board over every year as well, because he said they need to understand what is really crucial and what's so important about this wonderful place that is Canterbury and the vision of Canterbury, and sharing in Robert's and my vision for what that place is and can be. So I think that then, naturally off the back of that, we were then invited to come over for various commencement suppers or to convocation and to different things, graduation and sort of different things through the years. And so it just became a twofold exchange, if you like, with the two of us coming over, and then with the wonderful students and the team coming over, and then more latterly with members of the trust as well, the trustees of the centre.
This is final question, and then I'll hand it back to Zach. It's a difficult time in the U.S. for many. What do you think Robert would have to say to this moment?
Be patient and be kind. And so I think that and it really is a difficult time for everyone. And so it doesn't matter whether you're red, blue, or purple. I think that actually everybody is very uncertain. It's a very scary time in the world. The political uncertainty in not just the Middle East and the Ukraine and Russia, but actually right the way through Europe, and in this country and in the UK. It's really difficult. I mean, we've got a stable parliament at the moment, but actually not much confidence in the government. And I think that people just don't know what the answers are to this sort of existential crisis of the fact that all of the models that we've been using for the world, that have ordered the world and given us such relative peace, are crumbling. And so the financial status and the sort of social status, if you like, and the sort of political status have all changed over the last 100 years. And nobody quite knows what the answers are. Nobody knows. I think there are wonderful people working in all parties trying to find solutions and answers for the betterment of people. There are some scurrilous individuals as well, but they are in every party and in every country. And so I think that yeah, just be patient and be kind.
Thank you so much, Fletcher.
Well, Fletcher, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I don't know if you remember, but I was part of a transitional year at Berkeley whereby the administration, as they were changing over, actually forgot to book our rooms at the Canterbury Cathedral Lodge. So my class, instead of going to Canterbury for spring break, was meant to go to the Anglican Center in Rome, which we did go to Rome for the first week of spring break, but you and Robert called absolutely distraught at the notion that we would not also spend a week in Canterbury, and somehow managed to find rooms all across the deanery. I felt like Harry Potter sleeping under a staircase for the second week of spring break, which happened to be Holy Week.
It was wonderful.
A gift to spend Holy Week of my final year at seminary at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, with you at Canterbury. And I had just been ordained a deacon, and so I actually got to renew my vows with Robert and the gang, Archbishop of Canterbury, in the cathedral. But a few moments stand out so clearly from that week. Of course, the candlelit vigil, but then at the Chrism Mass, this was mentioned in his obituary, where Robert, as the celebrant, would literally take off his chasuble, take off his priest's chasuble, and turn his stole diagonally to take the form of a deacon, the form of a servant, modeling Christ who took the form of a human to serve us, as he would kneel down to wash the other's feet. I've never seen another Anglican liturgy where the presider actually turns their stole back towards a deacon, and it speaks to that heart of a servant and just the kindness and generosity and gentleness that exuded from Robert's heart, mind, and soul. He really shaped, and you together really shaped a generation of Berkeley seminarians. And the mantra that continues ringing in our souls that Robert would say again and again is, show them Jesus.
Yep.
Show them Jesus, which he did
Yep.
in his life, his ministry, his quiet witness to the God of all creation.
Well, I should say as well that actually his last Chrism Mass ever was actually here with the absolute barn-raising sort of service by a very, very new, I think it was his first service, Bishop Hyde, and who we're big fans of. And so his last Chrism Mass as deacon was actually here in St John the Divine, which was very special.
That is so special. Well, Fletcher, what's next? How do you envision Robert's legacy continuing? And
that's a very good question, and I think that it would be very easy with a certain number of scars and an awful lot of sleepless nights over the last 23 years to sort of lock that door and think, okay, me time, I'm going to go off and have a sort of my own life now and sort of do something very different. It feels a bit of a cheat to do so, and I think that having spent 23 years with him, I don't know quite what that's going to look like, but I think that I've had a wonderful life as well, and alongside, everything is always yin and yang. It's always sort of good and bad, and I think that the friends that we've made and the life that we've had has been so extraordinary, and I feel so lucky having had that, and so I think that life obviously will be different without him, and the ministry will be different because he's not at the absolute root of it. But I feel that whatever happens, that I owe it to him to try and keep that message alive, and to do what I can to try and do a little bit of good in the world. So I'm not quite sure what that will look like yet, but I want to carry on at least in part doing some work. So.
Well, all our love, all our prayers, our deepest sympathies in your loss, and know that here at St. Bart's, you always have a home.
I know that. Thank you.
Welcome
Thank
home.
you. Thank you.
Why don't we end with one of Robert's hymns, the one that we sang today at the 11 o'clock choral Eucharist here at St. Bart's. Earth's fragile beauties we possess as pilgrim gifts from God, and walk the slow and dangerous way his wounded feet have trod. Though faith by tragedy is rocked, and love with pain is scored, we sing the pilgrim's song of hope, your kingdom come, O Lord. Earth's human longings we possess, earth's love or grief compelled, to take and bear the heavy cross Christ's wounded hands have held. By cloud and fire he leads us on, through famine, plague, or sword, singing with faith the pilgrim's song, your kingdom come, O Lord. God's own true image we possess, God's innocence first known, now tainted by the hate and spite, to Christ's own body shown. By that same wounded heart of love, God's image is restored, to sing again the pilgrim's song, your kingdom come, O Lord. Amen.
Amen. Amen. No, I was just going to say that always amuses me because Robert wrote that. He was doing it for a commission, and he actually finished that off whilst keeping my parents waiting for lunch in a lay-by on the side of the road, and I ended up having to walk to the pub because he was going to be too late, and my mother getting very cross, and then he came in, and I thought this was quite early on in our relationship, and I thought this is going to be an interesting sort of time, but this is going to be jolly difficult, and of course Robert came in and said, "I'm so sorry I'm late, I was writing a hymn," and of course my mother instantly forgave him, and somehow it was my fault that I'd inconvenienced him, and that was the dynamic really for the rest of Robert's life. So you could never be cross with him for long.
She thought the kingdom might come before he returned.
I think so.
Well, Fletcher, what a true and absolute gift. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
our love.
Thank you. Thank you. Cheers.
And don't be a stranger. You've got to come back.
I will.
All right.
I will. Thank you very
Until
much.
next time.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.